The philosopher Achille Mbembe has helped to frame and reframe my thinking about a great number of subjects, from colonialism and capital, to the futures of race and racism, to the unending struggles that we are called to for the carving out of places and spaces to be human, to be recognized as inheriting a share of the world in which we are all co-inheritors, though simultaneously being burdened with the ethical distribution of such a world. Now, the concept of race, the processes of racialization, and the fundamentalism of white supremacy at the onset of European modernity have long intervened in that process and are a major focus of my doctoral project on coloniality in the British context. This is how I came to the topic of my paper. More than that, however, I am interested in efforts to diagnose certain diseases such as racism and sexism, which are not essentially inscribed with the same structures that we seek to dismantle, which is to say that in critiquing racism, sexism, and colonialism, it should not be necessary to prove to the racists and the misogynists and imperial apologists the many ways in which their worldviews are disastrous, inherently violent, structurally genocidal, not to mention contradictory and riddled with anxiety. In the very concept of race, we are witness to a silencing, that some are not worth listening to, not worth seeing even, or further still, that the racialized do not say anything that we do not already know. Now, I am invested in the fact that the racialized have never been silent, and in fact speak, think, and act in ways which are incomprehensible to white reason. They escape what I have called in my paper the imperial frame, and furthermore, they contain the instruments to dismantle that same frame. What I am trying to achieve in my paper is to utilize these instruments in an attempt to undo the epistemic violence of racism, sexism, and colonialism, arguing that a language already exists to remedy their disembodying effects. Smashing the imperial frame, as I have it, is to rethink, or more accurately to make re-exist, certain modes of thinking about the basic parameters of being in the world, of time, of space, and of self. Taking seriously the rhetoric of modernity, I show how these narratives and myths which spring forth from the principle of race have perverted these basic parameters for those perceived as being in a state of race, a condition which has long been assumed to be one of degeneracy, backwardness, and perhaps most familiarly, in need of improvement. With time, I show how conceptions of a mechanical, progressivist, and linear understanding has been essential to forming and maintaining specifically colonial matrices of power, locking racialized others in a timeless space in need of modernizing, of bringing into the modern. Instead, a critique of time as something much more ambiguous, fragmented, and nonlinear, towards a kind of humility about time's fundamentally inaccessible character is called for. The need for time's re-enchantment with important and critical implications for the meanings of dominant notions as history, progress, development, success, and failure. Secondly, I argue for space to be reconceived on a planetary scale, as opposed to the provincial notions of nation-state, especially in the context of ecological collapse and the uneven distribution of the world that has been based on formations of power and wealth over the last 500 years. The break that came between humans and the cosmos in conjunction with the mechanization of nature as brute and inert matter allowed and still allows the uninhibited extraction of its living and value-laden material and the displacement and theft of indigenous land, often these two processes being in support of each other as practices of the corporation, in the name of science even, and often with the patronage of states themselves. In the recognition of space as planetary, rather than in terms of the national, international, or even global, all of which are invoked to maintain hegemonic matrices of power, there is a move to comprehending the pluriversal, that is, the universality of our elemental vulnerability to the wrongs that we visit upon each other and the ultimate indivisibility of the in common. Finally, the human self. In the narratives of European modernity, the self did not represent a given entity. It was, in fact, an idea of particularity, that of the white, propertied man, and thus worked to exclude much of the planet from the enclosures and alleged safety of being modern. I call for a different relationship with singularity and difference, one which recognizes the universal as the site of a multiplicity of singularities. Euro-America is not the world, it is only a part of it. I argue that there is no relation to oneself that does not implicate the other. It is, therefore, our differences that we paradoxically share. With this in mind, the structural closure or the resistance to the structural closure of identities, the fact that differences always exist and always mediate between us, might lead to a conception of the self as the guarantor for the other's share. The work of decolonization has long been in process, with ever newer barriers, institutional as well as epistemic, being constructed. The chief argument of my paper is that the projects of silencing, according to the principle of race, are never complete. There are always cracks in the imperial frame, and it is due to our own illiteracy that these voices in the cracks are not heard. As we know, decolonization is not a metaphor, but refers to the deeply unsettling project to undo a deeply genocidal formation. The coordinates for such a project, I have argued, are time, space, and self, but there is yet much more work to be done.